Hi, this is Matt Hug with Nonprofit.Courses. Thanks for joining us today for an interesting webinar on corporate philanthropy, brought to us by Sydney Faye Williams of Double the Donation. So let's get started.
Thanks for having us. I'm Sydney Faye. I'm from Georgia, so it's like Mary Kate, Sydney Faye. And I've been with Double the Donation for about 4 or 5 years. I have a background in university fundraising. So I managed a phone-a-thon center at my alma mater and led up our student philanthropy council at my alma mater as well. But I switched to DTD, learned a lot about matching gifts along the way. And really, we're going to take some time today to talk about different types of corporate philanthropy, and then to put a focus on the 2 main types of volunteer grants and matching gifts that nonprofits have kind of the most control over, and you guys can kind of drive in the most revenue.
Great. Oh, and before you start, what school was that?
KSU, Kennesaw State University.
All right.
I'm an owl.
Well,
I'm also a Nighthawk. I went to Thomas University as well first. So I got my first degree from Thomas University, and then my second and third from Kennesaw State.
Oh my goodness. Wow. You're steeped in the educational environment. That's great. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Sydney Faye. So let's get started.
Awesome. So a little bit more about DTD before we dive in. Like I said, I've been with DTD for about 4 or 5 years. We were started in 2011 by our president, Adam Weinger. Maybe you guys have seen him at a conference or two. He typically travels with us pre-COVID or seen him on some webinars. But Adam worked, for a Fortune 500 company, participated a lot in local nonprofit fundraising or volunteering, like local, his alma mater Emory or Big Brother Big Sisters in Atlanta area, but never really had a chance to submit a matching gift, not because he didn't know what they were, but because he lost his matching gift form, coffee spilled on it, or just never got around to submitting because the nonprofits never reminded him. So he kind of figured it wasn't that important. Then realized all of his coworkers who were also participating in volunteer events and fundraising events who were also eligible never submitted matching gifts either. So, seeing a problem within the nonprofit space, he quit his job, built what was the first iteration of our matching gift services and traveled the country and got some folks signed up. And here we are, 10 years later with 4,000 plus clients in the nonprofit space, over 60 plus platform partners. So we partner with donation pages, wealth screening engines, and CRMs, all designed to help nonprofits best leverage corporate matching gifts, as well as some volunteer grant functionality as well. So super cool story.
Yeah.
Tons of tidbits about us. We host a database of over actually 24,000 matching gift companies now, which is super exciting. We've identified over 200 million match eligible dollars for our 4,000 plus clients. And like I said, we have tons of partners in the fundraising space. So we like to consider ourselves kind of, the know-it-alls of the corporate philanthropy industry. We've been in it for about a decade. So we're going to cover about...
I'm sorry. Yeah, before you go too much farther, those native integrations, are those with programs like, the popular gift processing programs?
So those were Blackbaud technology partner. So when you think about Blackbaud, those online donation forms, Luminant, Teamraiser, Online Express, Net Community, Raiser's Edge NXT, Classy, Fundraise Up, Fundraise, Run Sign Up, really any of the fundraising platforms you could think of, Salesforce, as well as CRMs we integrate with.
Oh, good. That's great. That's a big help.
Yeah. And we have a partnerships page that I can link or show you guys how to find towards the end of the webinar if you're curious to see kind of our full list of partners.
Excellent.
But today, we really want to dive into what corporate philanthropy is and focus on matching gifts and volunteer grants. So we'll talk a little bit about, the 5 overarching types of corporate philanthropy, and then dive into, matching gifts and volunteer grants, what DTD tends to specialize in. So kind of getting everyone on the same page of what corporate philanthropy is. Really, corporate philanthropy is a way for the big companies within our nation and other nations to show that they care about local nonprofits and the communities that nonprofits are serving by simply giving out money or grants to the nonprofits and to the people within that community. So they get a tax write-off, just like, I or you would get a tax write-off for making a donation to a nonprofit we care about. And over the years, there's been a number of different corporate philanthropy programs developed, all with the intent of kind of making sure that they can support people and communities that kind of fall in line with the missions of their own company, right? So there's 5 major types of corporate philanthropy. There's volunteer support, employee grant stipends, community grants, which I'm sure you guys have heard about, maybe more than the others, volunteer grants, and then corporate matching gifts. To give you a kind of an overview of, starting with number 1, volunteer support. So volunteer support is much different than volunteer grants. It's actually when these types of programs partner with actual employees of nonprofits to provide specialized volunteer support services. So I'm sure, me being in nonprofit industry and you guys being in nonprofit world, you understand that everyone's wearing 27 different hats. And sometimes the ability to kind of get things like accounting done or get people trained on software can be a hard thing to do, not because of lack of knowledge or lack of effort, but maybe because just a lack of time or bandwidth. So there's tons of companies that offer their employees time to go volunteer with nonprofits to provide those services. So I mentioned like tax services. A good example would be IBM. IBM, sends a lot of equipment and a lot of their employees' times out within a university space to programs that are focusing on like engineering or the STEM field to get some of those volunteer support services out there as well.
Now in Philadelphia here, we have Comcast does this Comcast Day or something, and the employees go out en masse and volunteer at places. Would that be the same thing?
Perfect example of employees going out and volunteering. And it's especially if employees are going out and volunteering and offering specialized services to the nonprofit specifically. Okay. So skills or services that will help the nonprofit with their own internal work or internal missions.
Excellent.
So volunteer support, it's growing. It's not the most popular form of corporate philanthropy because it is so specialized, and it actually got kicked off around 2014, 2015. So it's pretty new compared to the other types of ways corporations are supporting nonprofits. But if you could find a nonprofit or if you could find a company that offers some specialized services that would benefit your nonprofit, it is a good way you can start asking, especially on your corporate relations side, to kind of build that relationship and kind of get your foot in the door with that company as well. Because sometimes it's easier for a company to be willing to give services or technology first, and then you can kind of get your foot into the door for like a big monetary gift as well.
Cool.
Looking at employee grant stipends. So employee grant stipends are also not as popular as like corporate matching gifts or community grants, but it is up and coming. And that it's basically where a company says, employees, we believe that you have a good understanding of what our mission is as a company. And we believe that you are kind of ingrained into your community and you know what nonprofits are doing the best work amongst your communities. So we're going to kind of open up this pool of money that you guys can choose a nonprofit that you believe deserves it. Tell us who it is, and then we'll, as a team, decide which nonprofits are actually going to get these dollars at the end of the day. So it's basically where employees can kind of advocate for the nonprofits they really care about to be in line to get some of these stipends or some of these grant dollars from companies. And companies kind of let the employees do a little bit more of the work on their end to identify the nonprofits and get those submitted into that program. So all of the programs, especially this one, are really employee initiated. If you can find a company that offers employee grant stipends, it's really good to work on maintaining those relationships, obviously with the donors who work for those companies, and that, you can kind of let them know not only may you be corporate matching gift eligible, but your company also offers these really cool stipends that you can advocate for us to get if you really believe in the work we're doing within our local community. So another really cool program. Then we get to community grants, which most nonprofits have heard of community grants. Most of you guys have someone who's doing grant writing. I did a little bit of grant writing myself when I was an undergrad. And really, it's where you are writing grants or participating in these application programs for community funds sometimes, corporations especially, And then, some other types of larger nonprofits, there's a lot of athletes who have these different type of foundations that offer grants as well. But specifically from the community grant and corporation side, it's where a company very clearly outlines what they're looking to support for the year, the next coming years. And they invite nonprofits who may have programs or services they're trying to roll out or sustain to apply for those grants so they can get the funding to make sure that those programs can exist and that target population is served. Like I wrote a grant that actually we won for a local nonprofit in Marietta, Georgia for anti-bullying. So we reached out to a corporation who was trying to, invest in making sure middle school age kids, weren't getting bullied and there was education being done within the school system. And we wrote to it and we won. So that was really exciting. And that funded a new program that we actually wanted to roll out. So really cool. A lot of you guys are probably super familiar with community grants. Going on to volunteer grants, which is just as common. You'd be surprised as like corporations to offer community grants or employee stipends, but less taken advantage of. Volunteer grants are literally where you as a nonprofit may have tons of volunteers, people who volunteer with you maybe an hour out of the year, or people who volunteer with you, 100 hours out of the year because you see them every event or every weekend. A lot of those folks probably work for companies that offer dollars in exchange for their employees giving you guys hours. And it's very simple. On average, it's about 10 hours that a person has to volunteer with your nonprofit over the course of a year. And then when they hit that threshold, that 10-hour threshold, often the company will give anywhere from like $100 to $200. Disney gives up to $2,000 for folks who are volunteering for 100 hours plus a year. So there's
whom? They give that to whom?
The nonprofit.
Oh, okay. So the person not only brings their time and talent, but they bring their treasure.
Exactly. So volunteer grant programs are really lucrative for like your food banks, your homeless shelters, even some slightly religiously affiliated nonprofits who have like a food bank or, a program that's separate of their congregation. Universities, if you have a lot of student volunteers, sometimes you can leverage volunteer grants, but really any type of nonprofit where you have people consistently showing up and helping you out with events. As long as they work for a company that offers volunteer matches, they can get those hours submitted. And it's just submitting an application. The tricky part is that on a nonprofit's end, you just have to have a way to make sure you can communicate the number of hours that the person's actually volunteered with you. So you want to make sure you have a way to track, right? Because you might have a donor who shows up every single Saturday and helps you go through paperwork and they volunteer 5 hours a week. But if you're not tracking it, it's going to be hard for them to actually submit and ask to get those hours matched. So that's the key part there. If you're not already tracking your volunteer hours to start, to make sure you guys can give them the number of hours that they should apply for.
Now, I imagine it's important for the nonprofit to make this known that recording is going to lead to more money for them. Because I've known nonprofits who seem to be doing this, but I wouldn't know behind the scenes how, whether I think they're getting money for that now that you say it, but they've never said anything.
Yeah, as we get deeper into today's conversation, we'll talk about different ways to kind of make sure that your volunteers are aware that they're potentially eligible for volunteer grants and corporate matching gifts. But you're right, you do want to raise that awareness amongst your volunteers that they're eligible because, if someone works for Coke and volunteers one year, they may switch to Home Depot or Disney the next. And if they're aware that they're eligible at Coke, they're more likely to check in to see if the same programs are offered at their future employees as well. So making sure volunteers are aware, a big part of making sure those dollars come in the door.
That's great.
Awesome. And then we get to matching gifts, right? So we'll do a lot of focus on volunteer grant and matching gifts because these two are the groups that nonprofits tend to have the most control over, and that, the more input you put into making sure donors are aware about the programs, the more output as in revenue you can get back from these corporate philanthropy options. But matching gifts, all of you guys have probably heard about corporate philanthropy in the form of matching gifts. About over 65% of the Fortune 500 companies are offering corporate matching gift programs. And it's very simple. It's an employee who works for a company that offers the program, who gives to a nonprofit that falls under those companies' guidelines, who says, I want this gift matched. And then the company sends out a check to that nonprofit, or like an ACH payment. when we think about the number of employees we believe in the US that could be eligible for corporate matching, we're really talking about 26 plus million folks that work for companies that could get their gifts matched. Are all of them giving? In a perfect world, all of them would be giving. But when you think about all those folks who could give and could get their gifts matched, it's a huge amount of revenue for the nonprofit industry. And it's about $4 to $7 billion we estimate being left on the table each year of unclaimed match revenue of people who are giving, but not being prompted to get those gifts matched. And so the matching gifts just never come in the door for the nonprofit.
So that's free money out there waiting.
A lot of free money and enough to go around, for sure, to all the nonprofits out there. Yeah. So now diving in a little bit more to talk about the specifics of volunteer grants and matching gifts, and then switching later on to talk about ways you can make sure you're getting all those dollars in the door. I just want to cover a few quick basics of volunteer grants to make sure everyone's on the same level of understanding. So you'll see some similarities in how these programs are broken down between corporate matching gifts and volunteer grant programs. Really, nonprofit eligibility, when you think about program components of how you're determining if volunteer grants are worth you pursuing, is really going to be based off, are you as a nonprofit eligible? The simplest thing to kind of think about is there's kind of this spectrum of which nonprofits and where you guys fall and the eligibility standpoint. So religious organizations and political affiliated organizations, so 501c14s or churches often fall on the likely not eligible spectrum when it comes to volunteer grants. And then your universities and your K through 12 schools fall on the other end of being the most likely to be eligible. And then if you're a museum or a healthcare facility or food bank or somewhere in the middle, you're going to be eligible for about 80 to 85% of the existing volunteer grant programs out there.
And these are all that eligibility is set by the donor companies.
Exactly.
Right.
So all the program components are set by the company itself. So they can vary depending on Coke to Home Depot to Walt Disney to Bank of America.
Those smaller community organizations, or community businesses, because I know some who will do churches and religious and others who won't do higher ed. So that makes sense. Yeah.
They're all set. And then you're right. Sometimes, especially for religious organizations who are receiving dollars outside of just, church services or worship. Mm-hmm. If you have a food bank or a shelter, or you're providing some type of financial services to your congregation, those types of gifts can often be eligible as well.
Yeah.
Once as a nonprofit, you kind of know your status, at least you think you're eligible, or you have an idea if you're eligible or not for volunteer grants. Of course, you need to have volunteers, but you also want to make sure you understand, the amounts that you're eligible for as well, because sometimes when you're thinking about where you're going to put your fundraising time in for the year, if you, have 2 events over the course of the year and, maybe have a handful of volunteers, it may not be worth you heavily pursuing volunteer grants on the mass scale. But if you have tons of events and thousands of volunteers over the course of the year, the grant amounts ranging from $100 to $2,000 could be very valuable for you guys. It could add up to a lot of money, and it could add up to pay off the cost of your time you put into getting the word out there about those donors and those volunteers. So making sure you think about, is, $100 to $2,000, $100 to $2,000, that is it worth it per volunteer that you could potentially get back in the time that you put in to reaching out to those folks? And then are folks eligible? Typically volunteer grant programs, retirees, part-time and full-time volunteers are all eligible. You do see with volunteer programs that retirees are more eligible than for volunteer grants and corporate matching, because, studies show that as someone tends to get a little bit older or get closer to that retirement age, people are more likely to start spending more of their time giving back because they have more time. They might not be doing 40 to 50 hours a week anymore. So you might have more retirees that are more eligible for volunteer grants and matching gifts at the end of the day, which if that fits in kind of with the folks who are showing up for you in that sense, it might work for you guys to pursue volunteer grants. There's always going to be some minimum hours required. It's likely 10 to 20 hours required per year. So someone can't show up for an hour and then get, that hour matched. But if you have someone who does 10 hours or 20 hours or more over the course of the year, the company is likely to match that. And then of course there's program deadlines, meaning that if, you're in a rush and you go back and find people who volunteered for you for 100 hours in 2013, the company's not going to match those because the time has passed. So you want to stay within that January to December timeframe of when you're marketing your volunteer opportunities and marketing those hours to get matched through grants as well.
So Sydney Faye, I can see this really being helpful for organizations who do mass people events like cleanups of a neighborhood, or building a trail, or packaging food for some reason, something where you're going to have a lot of people together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it goes in line with thinking about, what is that $100 to $2,000 range in volunteer grants? What could that add up for you guys? If you have a handful of volunteers, you may want to focus on matching gifts. But if you have tons of volunteers, like you said, people showing up to pack food, or like Habitat for Humanity, for example, where you pull people from all different types of walks of life, it could potentially equal a good amount of revenue for you, especially. Volunteer grants, the basic of volunteer grants in the submission process is very similar to matching gifts. You'll see as we walk through the matching gift steps as well. Step one, the person has to volunteer. When you're thinking about what needs to occur before you can get those dollars, obviously someone has to show up and volunteer. Then the donor has to know how many hours they volunteered in order to submit a request to get those hours matched to their company. So that's a very company specific process. Home Depot might have an online form, whereas Ping and Random House might have a PDF form. So very company specific for that donor. Once the donor says, I want my hours matched, then the company will either approve and say, yep, we're going to send this nonprofit a check, or they may ask you as a nonprofit to verify that this donor volunteered 50 hours this year, and then you'll get a check, step 4. So very basic process, not a 20-step process, but step 2 by far is where most people get tripped up, and being able to actually submit and knowing how to submit and knowing how important it is to get those hours matched. Because step 2 is so tricky, while there's 45% of Fortune 500 companies that offer volunteer matching programs. And when we think about these Fortune 500 companies, remember, these are the companies likely employing the most amount of people. So there's tons of people eligible for corporate volunteer grants. We estimate 80% of volunteers have no clue that they're even eligible in the first place. So tons of people who are eligible, but the majority of them don't know. And that's why we see about less than 5% of those people who could actually submit each year actually submitting to get their hours matched. So a tiny portion of people who could get their hours matched actually are. Some other cool stats, I think when we think about like millennials and Gen Zs and baby boomers and all these different generations who are giving back time and also money, 30% of baby boomers are now volunteering. And because, baby boomers are a large amount of people, represent a large majority of the living population, that's tons of people who are volunteering, who are likely eligible, who are still working or maybe retired, who can get those hours matched as well. And then on the millennial side, my generation, research shows millennials are starting to give more of our time than we are financially back. So 7 out of 10 millennials volunteer regularly on weekends or after work, or just because they just want to give back. So it's important to kind of think about what your volunteer population looks like as well, to think about who you can reach out to get those gifts in their door.
Sydney Faye, I can imagine actually pitching this idea from as a nonprofit to a company that you might have a good relationship with, to say, hey, if we get a lot of your people showing up, will you do this kind of match for us? I could see some employers, local employers really going for something like that.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, like a good step in the door to try to build out maybe a relationship with the large local corporation to you, right? And saying that, like, we're not really asking for like direct money yet. We're not asking you just to write us a $500,000 check. We are asking that if we can get the buy-in from your company culture and prove to you that your employees believe what we're doing is important, can you then match the hours they volunteer with us? So Exactly. It removes some of that stigma around just kind of give us money because we're a nonprofit, and adds, like, if we're already showing you that the company culture you work so hard to invest in believes in us, then like it's easy peasy. Of course you guys should support us because your employees do.
Yeah, no, that'd be really good.
Yeah. And then you can even make it like a one-day event. It doesn't have to be throughout the year. So if you wanted to do like a big one-day push, you could. You can make the argument that it's only one day or only one weekend that you can get as many people to show up for you as possible. You could do that as well. Awesome.
Cool.
So that's kind of the basis of volunteer grants. Pretty simple in that there's revenue on the table, there's tons of people volunteering, and a small percentage of people actually getting those hours matched. Now to talk about matching gifts a little bit, we'll move through it a little bit quicker because it's kind of laid out in the same way. And that corporate matching gifts are, I believe the most popular form of corporate philanthropy in the sense that the most people are eligible for it. But it's the least commonly used or least commonly taken advantage of, because when you think of matching gifts, a lot of people say it's like low hanging fruit or it's like free money. But anything that you have to put time and elbow grease into always pays off. So if we can pivot it from not being free money to being like well-earned money, I imagine that $4 to $7 billion worth of dollars on the table would significantly reduce. So going in line with the same program components, these should look kind of familiar in that as a nonprofit, you want to make sure you're eligible. So again, if you are a K through 12 school or university, you're eligible for more of the nonprofit corporate matching programs out there, around 90% plus. If you're a religious organization or politically affiliated, like you lobby, you may be eligible for less corporate matching programs. And then if you're a healthcare institution or like a hospice or food bank or museum, you're somewhere in the middle. And again, corporations can pick and choose and decide who they want to match and who they do or may not want to match. It's all up to them. Thinking about the ratio, just like volunteer grant programs, they may give $100 to $2,000 in a kind of volunteer grant stipend. Matching gifts have a match ratio, and that the most common one is 1-to-1. John gives $50, Home Depot gives $50, but we've seen ratios be, 0.5 to 1. So someone gives 50, the company might give 25. And then we've seen 5 to 1. So someone gives 100, the company gives 500. So it's really all over the place, depending on what the corporation is deciding to give out as far as ratios. And it can vary, the ratio, based off the actual employees' status at the company. So if they're full-time, retiree, or part-time, that ratio may change. Or if they sit on the board out of a company, they may be eligible for a higher ratio than someone who may be, like an everyday worker like you or I, someone who's in management, or for example, if someone works at, Home Depot, someone works in an actual store versus the corporate office. Now, those can change eligibility.
I've also seen the ratio change when it comes to what they're getting. Computer companies, at least at one point, if the person was leveraging software to the company, to the nonprofit, they would get a higher ratio than if it was cash, or if it was hardware, computer hardware, or something like that.
You're right. In some cases, if someone are giving like in-kind gifts, for example, those can be matched, or the value of those can be assessed a little bit higher than like a monetary gift. You're absolutely right. And those types of gifts, the STEM related donations, or even sometimes land, things like that, can be matched. It's definitely more of a rarity, but it can be matched for sure by some corporations.
Yeah.
I met a nonprofit at a conference that someone gave them a farm. It was a university. Someone gave this university a farm. And the company that person worked for gave them a 1-to-1 match of what the farm was worth. Because they were definitely high up in the company, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that they received in value from this farm, but then also from this match because of the person donated it, and they got their company to match the value of the farm.
Well, and similarly, you mentioned about board members. I worked for a university where we had a board member on our board. He was a board member of a company, but he also served on like 3 or 4 different boards, not just the company he was employed by. And his $1,000 gift ended up being like $10,000 or $15,000 by the time we collected all the matches from all the places that he was eligible for.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. And then it's something else that sometimes nonprofits forget is this whole idea of spouse eligibility exists.
Yes. Ooh,
so whereas, my spouse may work for a high school, but I work for Home Depot, if we make the gift together, then Home Depot will still match the gift because I'm a spouse. So And then there's like double matches in that, let's say my spouse works for Coke and I work for Home Depot, then you can get that gift from us matched twice from my company, once from my spouse's. So there's all these different kind of, I won't call them loopholes, but all these different advantages you can get over volunteer grants and matching gift hours as well, if you kind of know where people work and you are marketing it to them and they know that they're eligible.
It's called leverage.
Exactly. And then, of course, gift amounts are going to vary based off the corporation, right? So, you can get anywhere from a $25 gift matched to, I think Disney, the most they match is $20,000 a year from one employee. Mm-hmm. So, that's tons of revenue that you guys can get matched from just a single donor. And then, of course, there's deadlines associated. So you can't get a gift match from 2013. You want to focus on, this calendar year's or sometimes fiscal year's worth of gifts that you can't pull in the door.
And the amount you mentioned is usually per employee. So they may not give that $20,000 all to you. They might spread it out over other nonprofits.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be one of the first nonprofits to establish that line of communication around matching gifts with your donors. And that 20,000, the average person isn't just giving to one nonprofit. Research shows the average person is giving to multiple nonprofits. And so that 20,000 is going to be split amongst those multiple nonprofits. But if you're the first to reach out, you're most likely the first that the donor decides to save those matching dollars for, or at least use the majority of them for the course of the year, because you can max out.
Yeah.
And the steps to getting matching gifts submitted are very similar to volunteer grants. It can often be the exact same application process in some examples, and that your donor has to give. The donor has to request that match be made based on that gift. You as a nonprofit may be asked by the company to confirm John Doe actually gave $1,000, and then you guys get a check or ACH. Very simple process. Again, where nonprofits and donors get tripped up is that step 2 of people actually finding their way to submit. So whereas 65% or more of Fortune 500 companies have corporate matching gift programs, and again, those being the companies who employ the most people, about 78%, we estimate, of match eligible donors never even get to the point where they actually submit those matches. So again, there's tons of people who are eligible who aren't submitting, which is why that $4 to $7 billion is left on the table each year, because it's just like floating money up there that no one's really taking advantage of. And the corporations, while of course they like to give back through corporate philanthropy, I don't know any corporation who's going to band together and say, let's figure out a way how we can get all these $4 to $7 billion out of our pockets back to the nonprofits, right? So it's really up to the nonprofits to do a lot of the marketing when it comes to, raising awareness and narrowing those gaps for volunteer grants in both matching gifts.
Well, and two things come to mind here. First of all, a lot of employees may not know their company does matching gifts, even though it's Fortune 500 or whatever, they just haven't a clue. And so you're educating them on that is really important. I think a lot of folks would just kind of wake up on that point. And also don't assume, right, that a company doesn't do that. There's a lot of smaller companies there. I can actually name a private school that matches their employees' gifts. So it's worth just asking and finding out about those employers of the people you interact with.
Absolutely. And then I think it's easy to forget that these companies have tons of subsidiaries as well. So like Disney has tons of subsidiaries. So someone works for ESPN can still get their gift matched under the Walt Disney Corporation corporate program. Disneyland, Disney World, all these different subsidiaries and different spelling variations, all those people, like you said, if you encourage them to ask, would probably find that they're still eligible. Johnson & Johnson has umpteen subsidiaries, right? Oh, yeah. So thinking about those different larger companies and how they can also be eligible as well, even though they might not say Johnson & Johnson, but getting them to ask or helping them figure it out is also very important.
Excellent point.
And that brings us to like this whole theory of combating the underutilization of like corporate matching gifts and volunteer grants. And that we talked a lot about all this revenues on the table and why people, maybe don't submit. But now I kind of want to focus on why it's so important to get people to actually submit and some ways you can encourage and raise awareness around these different programs. So typically I like to use language like reactive approach and proactive approach, right? Normally when I talk to nonprofits around volunteer grants and matching gifts, most of you guys are taking what I call like a reactive approach, and that matching gifts fall on the back burner. And that makes sense sometimes, right? Because if you have a certain allotted amount of team member hours to put towards fundraising, you're likely going to put those hours towards getting the dollars in the door first, and then matching gifts kind of come in as they may. But what that typically looks like is people are making gifts and volunteering with you guys all the time. You're not really inquiring about where they work, maybe not really sharing about matching gifts during that volunteer donating process. That donor may get some type of thank you messaging for volunteering or registering for an event that may or may not have any matching gift information on it. More times than not, there's no mention of how they can get that gift matched. There's limited visibility across your website and future marketing when you think about the kind of new donor rollouts or new volunteer rollouts that you trigger through emails and all these different marketing strategies. There's often no mention of ways they can further that gift or double or triple it. And then because of that, there's less people who submit, and that's how all that money gets left on the table. And you think about the average nonprofit, 5 to 15% of your gifts are eligible for some type of corporate matching program. And, a good percentage of your volunteers are likely eligible for a volunteer grant program. You really only get 1 to 2% of what you could be getting in versus that 5 to 15. So go ahead.
I'm saying that what I find is an obstacle is that a lot of folks find that an intrusive question. Where do you work? Not only to ask, but then also to receive as a request, because we don't educate them on the value of knowing that. Mm-hmm. That folks are, well, why do you care where I work? What are you using this information for? Well, if you want to help us, if you want to see this mission that you love move forward, we can really use that, and you can help us more, and we can help, and help them use that benefit they get.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I call it putting up speed bumps, and that sometimes as a nonprofit, you can be rightfully cautious, but sometimes cautious to ask questions that'll get you much further down the road if you would ask them. Because I know sometimes there's some hesitancy, like you said, around, making donors uncomfortable, maybe asking where they work, and then just not doing it at all, but then not being able to look at, your 5,000 donors over the course of the year and find the 5 to 15% of that could get their gift matched. And so, putting the time into making sure people are comfortable with sharing certain information like their company with you could add value definitely at the end of the year to when you're looking at what you could have gotten.
Exactly.
And what I like to encourage folks to do is think about the donor journey and the volunteer journey you've already laid out, and you've already put so much time into that, you're so dedicated to making sure it's protected today. So this is a very simplified version of a donor journey. I'm sure you're probably like, there's 20 other steps here that I don't see, Sydney Faye. So I know it's very simplified. But I like to really stress that if you're already putting in all this work to cultivate donors and volunteers, to get them to actually convert into giving you hours and revenue, to then steward them to come back and continue to give and retain those donors. Like, I'm sure you could sit and talk a whole day about all the different things you've tried and your different strategies. There's so many different things, or so many different ways within this current wheelhouse that you can just add in matching gift and volunteer grant ask, and encourage people throughout this wheelhouse to just get involved and raise awareness without having to reinvent the wheel here, because no one has time to reinvent the wheel. But if we break this kind of the things you're already doing down, there are ways you can mention matching gifts to make sure people are aware of corporate matching gifts, to make sure people are comfortable with you asking where they work, and to make sure people know how to submit. So for example, as you're cultivating donors, right? As people are visiting your website, as you're maybe putting ads up on Google, if someone's searching, maybe a certain type of research on a certain type of illness, like cancer or something like that, right? There's all different types of tracking I'm sure your marketing department is doing to make ads pop up. I get nonprofit ads all the time. If I'm on a cruise, there's a dance-a-thon happening for a nonprofit. If I'm checking out at Target, I'm being asked to donate to a nonprofit, so it's all billboards, all different types of ways nonprofits are cultivating and getting people to learn about what they do within their target population. Why not think about how you can also incorporate matching gift and volunteer grants into those same different strategies, right? So some really easy lifts are your website navigation bar, which I'll show you a couple examples. If you already have like a ways to give section where people can drop down and see all the different ways they can support you, volunteer grants and matching gifts should be listed, and you should have your own pages dedicated to giving these donors and volunteers the basics of what they need to understand about matching gifts and volunteer grants. So I'll show you a couple examples of that in a moment, but there's also fundraising appeals. So if you're sending out direct mail or emails about different ways people can support you guys, mentioning matching gifts in those, having different social media campaigns, I think is a big opportunity a lot of nonprofits forget about. Simply saying like, hey donor, it is almost November. You have 2 months to get any of your gifts matched this year, or 2 months to get any of your volunteer hours matched this year on a social media post, right? Everyone's on social media. And then giving them a link to how they can find their forms, or giving them a link to your dedicated matching gift page. If you're pushing out newsletters with exciting updates or hard ask for revenue or hard ask for support, including matching gifts in that. One really impactful thing I've seen nonprofits do, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, I think does this really well, is that in all of the email signatures across their fundraising team, they have something that says like, curious about matching gifts, click here. And it's a link that's taking donors to the matching gift page, right? And then mentioning matching gifts throughout the donation process. So really quickly, let me know if there's any questions, but I did want to show you a couple examples. I
could see this a real opportunity here to almost do a kind of a challenge-esque kind of program where you get a major donor who is willing to match those people who wouldn't otherwise get a match.
Mm-hmm.
And have that, have your own self-match kind of situation going on.
Absolutely, yeah, because you could take matches from any standpoint, from corporate matches to like like you said, your families or your one-off donors who are going to do a one-day match as well. Mm-hmm. Wanted to really quickly show you some quick examples of how you can increase visibility as people are visiting your website. Here's the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. When you click how to help under ways to give, they have employee matching gifts right here. So really front and center when we think about like cultivating donors, making sure people who are curious about how to get involved at all have a place to go. And then they have a really nice matching gift page. It's only dedicated to employee matching gifts. Nothing else on here that's going to distract the donor away. And then they have, of course, our search tool, but you can provide a search tool like this or your list or whatever you would like to donors to get corporate matching information as well. So we, of course, are providing access to forms and minimums and maximums, all the basic information that donors need to submit. But like I said, you can have your list or a tool or whatever you prefer on that matching gift page, or even just an FAQ section answering questions about matching gifts for those donors.
That's excellent.
Yeah. To show you one more quick example, let's see if I can get this pulled up real quick. Here we go. Here's MDA. Their matching gift page also can be accessed through their like how to support us up here, get involved. They have matching gifts here. And again, a page only dedicated to matching gifts with some stats they found interesting about electronic submission, their contact information and address that may be needed, and even like a phone number and email for people who have questions. Again, if you want to have a tool or a list here, you can, but if you want to have an FAQ or maybe a really impassioned message or even a video around what matching gifts have done, you can do that as well.
Well, like you mentioned, taking away what you call the speed bumps in this process is huge. And having something where they can automatically, like I love they can link directly to their corporate personnel portal and do the work is huge. I mean, that's great.
Yeah, when we think about the 78% of folks who don't know about corporate matching, or the 80+% who don't know about volunteer grants, it's often the exact same page that they have to use to submit. And just getting them to that page is half the battle, because you could see this isn't like a pretty URL that someone's going to remember. It's no one's going to remember this. So making it an easy lift for the donors is should be your number one focus. Making sure they can find matching gift information in volunteer grant. And once they find it, making it an easy lift for them actually to submit it and drive that to completion.
Yeah, it's not filling out the forms anymore.
Right. Not a PDF form. Yeah. It's like an online process.
Even the paper forms and have them.
Yeah. Then, thinking about some different ways, you can, continue to get donors and volunteers involved to kind of convert them into actual submitting matching gifts, is thinking about the same way you were converting people to give and actually hit submit that donation, and you are converting people to actually register for a program or an event. And that the perfect place to mention matching gifts and volunteer grants are while they're registering or giving, and then after they've completed registration or after they've given. So really quickly to show you some examples of that, I have some good examples. We'll go in line with, let's do LLS's peer-to-peer page. So they have, Light the Night. If you know LLS, you've probably heard of Light the Night, one of their largest events. This is one of their peer-to-peer pages where they're asking for a donation. They're asking for all the same information to get that gift process, but you can see they're also asking for company data and mentioning matching gifts throughout that giving process. So how you choose to mention matching gifts, whether it's like a sentence, because maybe matching gifts are a part of your larger donation culture already, or whether we look at like Second Harvest Heartland, if it's a little paragraph you put, it's really up to you on how you communicate why you're asking for that company data. I think that's the important part to remember, right? Providing as much context that you think your donors need on why you're asking for where they work, and then being able to capture where they work, whether it's our tool or freeform text tool. And then after they donate, being able to provide the matching gift results that they need to actually get access to those matching gift forms and guidelines on that thank you page as well. It's just as important. So if you go back and think about the LLS matching gift page where we have that form link and those mins and maximums, providing that same information on that thank you page can be just as valuable to your donors and your registrants as well. Because I think people also forget that sometimes you have those online pages for volunteer registration and they get this thank you message, thanks for volunteering. That's the perfect place to say, hey, by the way, when you show up next Sunday for this event, you might be able to get those hours matched. Here's how you can check in with your company now.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So, and there's other things you can do, like making sure that you have company specific email reminders. So maybe if it's very easy for you to find out who works for Home Depot, who works for Coke, who works for maybe Microsoft. Maybe those are your 3 largest companies in the area, right? Being able to track from capturing that company data, who works for those companies, and then triggering out, maybe some company specific emails. So here's an example of one we do for Alzheimer's that you guys can recreate if needed as well. So here's Alzheimer's Association saying, hey, John, we're super appreciative of your gift. This is just an example, not a real donor. You gave $50. You were really excited because you work for Home Depot, because maybe we captured that on our giving form, or maybe you volunteered and you told us you work for Home Depot. All you have to do to make sure you help us reach our matching gift goals this year is just click here. And now you're giving donors, if you can, direct access to those company specific forms, which again, you can focus on the top companies that you guys know are close to you, that you have a lot of donors for, and build out your own emails, or you could partner with someone like us to do it automatically. But either way, the goal here is to make, matching gifts and corporate volunteer grants an easy lift by saying, we know you're eligible, and here's how you're going to submit, or here's at least a link to our dedicated matching gift page where you can find out more. So really cool examples of different things you're already doing right. You probably already have some type of thank you receipt going out that you can mention matching gifts in. You definitely have a donation page and volunteer grant registration page that you can at least ask people where they work or prompt them to be curious about corporate matching gifts or volunteer grants. And you're thanking people on like a confirmation page or thank you screen already, where you can make a hard ask for matching gifts, especially in those donation processes. You're already doing tons of work to get people through that flow. So why not add matching gifts and volunteer grants where it's easiest, is something that's already constructed. And then if you do have like a phone-a-thon or, a donor care center, or someone who's calling volunteers, getting them to call if they're already thanking people, saying, thanks so much for your support. We hit our goal. By the way, we don't know where you work. If you want to share, you might be eligible for corporate matches. I can tell you if you like to share where you work as well.
And I don't know why I hit my head right now, but I know a lot of organizations, particularly those like hospitals or care centers and others, that have ongoing volunteers that aren't necessarily connected with the fundraising program, or even other kinds of that you might have a director of volunteers who runs a separate silo in the organization from the the development office,
Mm-hmm.
and getting those people engaged in volunteer grants would be great. I mean, a lot of times those folks don't get asked for regular charitable gifts, even though I think they should be. But it would be much easier to say, hey, do you or your spouse work for a matching gift company, or somebody retired from a matching gift company, and be able to do the volunteer grant thing.
Exactly. That's a really good point. That, yeah, and some organizations, volunteerism is not in the fundraising department, and those departments probably aren't even having conversations regularly.
Exactly.
But if you have a whole group of people who, some hospitals have, I'm sure it's changed now with COVID, but they had the people who came and sat with the premature babies for the body heat. I'm sure those people are never asked for gifts in some cases, but are coming from everywhere who are volunteering, that could be probably asked for volunteer match. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And then the final piece, I wanted to encourage you guys to think about is this whole idea of stewardship and retention, because our research shows that, when people know they're eligible for corporate matching gifts, they're 84% more likely to donate in the first place. Because it's kind of like this whole theory of like missing out, right? It's kind of the same reason there's sales in Publix. If they're telling you to buy 4 and you get 4 for the same cost as 5, or some type of special sale, you're more likely going to buy 4 boxes of pasta because it's on sale than just the one you initially, intentionally came in to buy. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to giving and volunteer trends. You see that if you find out that you're eligible for corporate matching or volunteer grants, you're more likely to give and participate, because there's something that you would be missing out on if you don't do it. So thinking about thanking those folks for participating is very important, because they're more likely to continue to participate in the future. So, right, a lot of you guys probably have annual days of giving or giving days. Why not couple it with the day of matching? The day of matching is one of my favorite ideas, because I think it's you've already done all of the work for your day of giving. You've talked about goals, you've done all the email streams. Why not schedule a blast for the next day of everyone who's given, to say, thanks so much. This is our day of matching. Here's how you can find out if you're eligible. I think that's one of the easiest lifts you could do as a nonprofit, to couple that to what should be your highest day of giving over the year.
I love it. It's matching gifts better than pasta.
And then there's tons of examples. Another one I'll highlight, won't go through all of them, but I'll highlight is that the same way we have like these giving clubs, right? So I got a letter in the mail from Kennesaw, asking me to give a certain amount so I could join a higher level giving club, right? And there's some, I can't remember the word, but there's like some heightened sense of connection to a university or to a nonprofit if you were giving and you get in like the President's Club or a certain club where they're recognizing you for participating, right? But every donor, every person can't give sometimes that monetary amount to get put into those clubs. And so having like your own club for people participating in matching gifts and volunteerism can provide the same level of like warm and fuzziness to someone who may not be able to give the same amount financially, but can get their gifts matched every single year, or get the most hours of volunteers matched. Getting them in certain types of clubs as well, I think, can go a long way to making sure people want to keep that status for one, but also appreciative of that recognition you're giving them.
And that's a really good point, and actually a nice way of threading that needle, because there's a lot of people, at least I've been in these discussions, where do you give that person who has the match credit or recognition for being at a higher level when other people don't have that benefit to be able to do that? And there's a whole discussion about fairness and equity and all that around between the donors, but giving that separate club where you recognize them specifically for that is a nice way of kind of getting out of that conversation and moving forward.
Yeah, and it's a nice way to recognize people in a whole different arena, right? Being able to thank people. Maybe, John Smith can't give 10 grand a year, because a lot of people I know can't give 10 grand a year, but you can recognize John that he has gotten every single gift he's ever made match for the last 3 years. And, that is just as important to donors and volunteers as, recognizing monetary gifts are. I think that goes a long way. And there's other examples here as well. But overall, impacts of making some slight changes or additions to your existing donor and volunteer journey is that following some of the recommendations we make, we've seen our nonprofit clients get more than 50% increase in folks who should be submitting, actually submitting, because now they know they're eligible and you're giving them the way they can submit. folks are getting closer to getting that 5 to 15% of what they're actually eligible for captured as a nonprofit. And then we're seeing 20 to 50% in actual revenue growth when it comes to matching gift revenue and volunteer grants by following some of these recommendations. Because it all boils down to just making sure matching gifts and volunteer grants are easy lift for donors, which means making sure they're accessible and they know how to submit. So on this screen, I'll wrap up here, but I like to provide like a checklist. It's an easy checklist that if you're looking at as a nonprofit and kind of where you can start, there's some leading questions on here that I like to think could be a good place to say, like, one really good one is if we Google our organization with matching gifts. So we Google Cat Rescue Club matching gifts, what comes up? Because we're a lot of nonprofit, nothing comes up at all. So I think there's some really good questions here that can kind of get you pointed in the right direction.
That's great. This is a really useful tool here to get people focused on matching gifts and what they need to do.
Awesome. And I know, we have a couple minutes left. So just wanted to see if there's any questions or any final thoughts on, corporate philanthropy in general or tips and tricks that you guys may be curious about.
Yeah, this has really been good. Thank you so much for the information. I mean, I've been in the business for a while. I learned a fair amount here, and this is important to keep in mind. That, like you said, you've already done the work. It just takes a little bit more effort to really reap a lot more for your mission, and that's what it's all about. Getting your mission funded so that you can do the great things you're committed to doing. And this is an excellent way of making that happen.
Exactly. If you ever want to reach us, we are on Twitter. Mm-hmm. I don't know who manages our Twitter, but I know we tweet.
Well, and when we post the video, there will be a link to your to double the donation if people want to connect with you that way. And I don't know, maybe we'll get a checklist worked in there too. Who knows?
Yeah, I think the checklist would be a great takeaway. We're also on LinkedIn. You can email me at sydneyfaye@doubletheDonation.com. We do tons of webinars. Tons of like matching gift guides and volunteer grant guides. So just visit our website and check out what we send out and follow up.
Thanks for joining us today for this presentation of Nonprofit.Courses Live. This is Matt Hugg, president and founder of Nonprofit.Courses, and I want to thank Sydney Faye Williams of Double the Donation for making a fine presentation for us today. Please join us again for Nonprofit.Courses Live, and until then, make it a great nonprofit.